From the Cube studios in Palo Alto and Boston, bringing you data-driven insights from the Cube and ETR. This is Breaking Analysis with Dave Vellante.
Much attention has been focused lately in the news on the useful life of GPUs. While the pervasive narrative suggests that GPUs have a shorter lifespan and operators are cooking the books by extending them to longer depreciation cycles, our research suggests that GPUs, like CPUs before them, have a significantly longer useful life than many claim. In this breaking analysis, we use some special graphics that we published as an infographic on thecuberesearch.com and siliconangle.com to explain our thinking in more detail. Here's the premise. In January 2020, Amazon changed their depreciation schedule for server assets from 3 years to 4 years. And this accounting move was implemented because Amazon found that it was able to extend the useful life of its servers beyond 3 years. Ken, if you would bring up the first graphic. Moore's law was waning, and at Amazon's scale, it was able to serve a diverse set of use cases, thereby generating revenue out of its EC2 assets for a much longer period of time. And then you can see here on this graphic, other hyperscalers follow suit and went through the 3 and 4 year cycles. Amazon in 2022, 2023, up to 5 years. Google and Azure just jumped from 4 years to 6 years. And so now all three hyperscalers are in that sort of 6 year cycle. So it's our view that that dynamic is going to hold, and that today's most demanding training infrastructure will be used to serve a variety of future use cases, thereby extending the useful life of GPUs beyond their initial purpose, which is, initially training. Now, at the same time, we believe that the more rapid innovation cycles that are being pushed by NVIDIA will somewhat compress depreciation cycles from their current 6 years to a more conservative 5 year time frame. So what we saw in that previous visual is AWS was out in the lead in terms of those depreciation cycles. If you bring up the next slide, Ken, we'll show you what some of the newer players are doing. So this bar chart compares the depreciation schedules across hyperscalers and adds in some of the neo clouds, CoreWeave, Nebius, and Lambda Labs. I didn't include Oracle on here. Oracle would be in the 5 years. So the big clouds, you can see they're anchored firmly at 6 years, and neo clouds take a little bit more conservative position, 5 years for Lambda and 4 years for Nebius. As I say, Oracle is 5 years as well. CoreWeave is the more aggressive outlier, which has a 6 year posture, despite the fact that they've got a highly AI intensive estate. So the neo cloud strategies, in our view, suggest that AI pure play economics are different from the cloud economics, and our interpretation is this sort of foreshadows some compression in the cycle. And so at the same time, though, as hyperscalers, because they have such huge scale, they will find, in our opinion, other opportunities to monetize their GPU estates. So let's take a look, Ken, if you would, bring up the next slide. This is what we think is going to happen. We've got this sort of premise that you're going to have a sort of 3-stage life cycle. So years 1 and 2, the primary economic life is the foundational model training. The middle bar here shows the 3 to 4 year period. The secondary, which is kind of the high value, we'll be doing real-time inference, still useful life, and then years 5, 6, a tertiary life. That's where you're going to support workloads like batch inference and analytics and other workloads that will emerge. So this value cascade structurally extends the GPU usefulness even as generations turn over quite rapidly. So, training requires peak performance. Inference can tolerate perhaps a little lower latency if it's actually done, at the edge. And of course, batch analytics, they can operate at the long tail. So this is kind of analogous to the server repurposing that we saw that justified past depreciation cycles. So let's look at the financial impact of this. If you go to the next slide, Ken. So if you look at 6 years, that's the de facto standard for depreciation cycles today. And then we can see that our belief is that 2 to 3x extended life is going to happen with this, what we're calling the value cascade, because it gives GPUs a longer economics life beyond the training role. And if you just add up Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, the actual impact of extending to 6 years collectively was about 7 billion. So, it definitely has material impact on the GAAP profitability from a net income statement standpoint. But at the end of the day, you're really talking about, maybe 10 to 12% of that net income. And so, yes, there's financial leverage from a longer depreciation cycle, and GPUs we think will compress that somewhat. But AI factories, they're not going to, in our opinion, go to a 2 or 3 year cycle. Again, that said, we're talking about, trillions of dollars of GPUs out there. So we're not saying it's de minimis. It is noticeable, but it's not game changing. So what we want to do now, let's kind of review the premise. If you bring up the next slide, Ken. So again, the premise is that you got 3 phases broadly. Phase 1 is training. That's kind of years 1 and 2. Phase 2 is inference, where you've got newer chips. They're coming out every 12 months, 12 to 18 months. Older GPUs cascade down to that high volume inference. And then the asset is still highly productive. It's generating, revenue per token. And then phase 3 is kind of the utility phase, years 4, 5 plus. And we think that is a sort of a viable model. If you go to the next slide, Ken, our second premise is that this compressed cycle will occur. We think the neoclouds are a harbinger of that. Having said that, we also think that, perhaps legacy general purpose CPUs become less effective over the longer term. And because hyperscalers have such a large, installed base of those sort of general purpose GPUs, they actually will become sort of less valuable. And so we could see a potential, this is sort of a premise that we're putting forth, we could see a potential that actually supports the compressed cycle as well. And then, but the bottom line is, we feel like cash flow is the much more meaningful metric. Ken, if you bring up the next slide, premise 3, we think that what cash flow does is it takes the income statement and the balance sheet and sort of reconciles those two. So we feel like net income, GAAP net income, non-GAAP net income, even operating income are going to be increasingly less important metrics for investors than cash flow, operating cash flow, and importantly, free cash flow. That really is what matters. And so the change in depreciation cycle won't affect that. And so that becomes a much more important metric in our view. So if you go to the next slide, Ken, just sort of synthesizing our premise, you've got this cascade effect. So GPUs, we don't think are disposable. Their utility curve is going to extend well beyond their initial training cycle. And then you've got this, 3, 4, and 5 year, what we're calling the sweet spot. Neoclouds, you can see, are adopting this 5-year cycle as kind of the average. It's more conservative, but it's still aggressive enough to show profitability, but it's also prudent and can kind of hedge against rapid obsolescence. And then, of course, as we said, cash flow is king, and that's something that we think is going to become increasingly more and more of the useful metric to watch. Okay, so in conclusion, our research indicates that the useful life of GPUs is going to continue to benefit from this, what we're calling the value cascade, going from training to sort of high value inference to more batch inference, which are going to allow assets to generate revenue well beyond their initial training window. And at the same time, the arrival of new chips and new architectures every 12, 15, 18 months are going to put more pressure on the formal depreciation schedule. So we believe that hyperscalers are ultimately going to converge on a 5-year cycle, shorter than today's 6-year model, but still supported by extended economic usefulness, i.e. revenue generation. So in the AI factory era, depreciation, yes, it's a lever that hyperscalers will use, and the winners are going to be the operators who maximize the utility curve of GPUs across training, inference, and even other workloads that emerge while maintaining access to compute, land, water, power, and the skills to build AI factories. So as CapEx scales into the trillions, cash flow, we think, is increasingly going to be the metric that investors will watch. Thank you for watching this breaking analysis. This is Dave Vellante, and we'll see you next time.